Welcome to The Explainer. We're diving into one of history's biggest religious divides, but probably not in the way you're expecting. We're not really going to focus on politics or conflict. Instead, we're going to ask a really interesting question about knowledge itself. How did two major branches of the same faith end up with completely different ways of protecting their most sacred teaching?
All right, let's just jump right in with a puzzle that has fascinated people for a long time. We know that the Prophet Muhammad's closest family, the al-Bayt, were absolutely central to his life and the early community. So why is it that when you look at the most famous, most authoritative collections of his sayings and actions, the Hadith, his family members barely show up as direct sources? It feels counterintuitive, right?
And here's that puzzle in black and white. These numbers are from Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. These are the heavyweights in Sunni Islam. And just look at those numbers. For figures as absolutely monumental as the Prophet's own grandson Hussein, or the later Imams like al-Baqir and al-Sadiq, the number of direct narrations is basically zero. It's just not what you'd expect at all, and it really makes you wonder, okay, what's going on here?
To figure this out, we really have to treat it like a historical investigation. We're going to start with the evidence we just saw, those numbers, and then we're going to rewind the clock to see if we can uncover the real reasons this all happened.
Okay, so this is a really crucial point. We have to separate the idea of respect from the idea of representation. Because as we're about to see, Sunni scholars had immense respect for the Prophet's family. So this isn't some simple story about them being deliberately left out. No, it's way more complicated. It's a story about methodology, about politics, and, at the end of the day, it's a story about survival.
To really get a handle on these different methods, you first have to understand the world they were created in. This story doesn't start in a nice, quiet library. It starts right in the middle of some really intense political turmoil.
For the first couple of centuries after the Prophet's death, the political scene was really dominated by two huge dynasties. First, the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids. And each of them had their own way of dealing with the Prophet's family, the al-Bayt. And these strategies, well, they ended up having massive consequences for how religious knowledge was passed down. Under the Umayyads, the pressure was really open and, frankly, aggressive. They had an official policy of cursing Ali, the Prophet's son-in-law, from the pulpits in the mosques. If you were caught narrating traditions that praised him, you could get into some serious trouble. The Imams themselves were constantly being watched, sometimes even arrested. In that kind of environment, teaching or narrating publicly from the Prophet's family became a really dangerous political act. It basically forced their teachings underground.
Now, you'd think things might have gotten better with the Abbasids, right? They actually used their family connection to the Prophet to justify their own revolution. But once they were in power, that whole dynamic shifted. That alliance turned into paranoia. Suddenly, they started seeing the Imams not as family, but as potential rivals for the top job. So the really open hostility of the Umayyads was replaced with something almost worse, a more systematic, suffocating kind of surveillance.
So what do you do when you're facing this kind of constant political pressure? How do you make sure a whole body of sacred knowledge gets passed on when teaching it out in the open is a huge risk? Well, the Imams and their followers adapted. They innovated. They came up with a pretty unique system that was basically designed for survival.
They essentially created what you could call a clandestine school. So instead of holding these big public lectures where anyone could just walk in, Imams like Muhammad al-Baqir and Jafar as-Sadiq built these small, private circles of students. And these students were vetted very carefully. You had to be trustworthy, you had to be dedicated. It was all about making sure the teachings could be passed on safely, far away from the prying eyes of the city.
And what this created was a totally different kind of network for passing on information. Back in the early days, you had thousands of the Prophet's companions narrating traditions in this big, open, public space. But the core of Imam as-Sadiq's school? It was made up of about 400 really trusted students. It was a smaller, deeper, and much more controlled flow of knowledge, built for security and precision.
And this right here is a really critical point. This was a fundamental shift in how you even think about a narrator. In this private school, the Imam wasn't seen as just one more link in a chain, repeating something he'd heard from someone else. No, he was seen as the living, infallible inheritor of the Prophet's knowledge. His words were basically a direct continuation of the Prophet's own guidance, the Sunnah itself.
Now, at the exact same time that this clandestine school was taking shape, a completely different system was being perfected out in the mainstream Sunni world. And it was built on almost the opposite set of principles. Not privacy and trust in one person, but openness and public verification.
For Hadith collectors like the great Imam al-Bukhari, authenticity was almost a science. It was all about a public audit. And his conditions were unbelievably strict. It wasn't enough for a narrator to just be a good, trustworthy person. You had to have proof that they physically met the person they were quoting. And, this is the most important part for our story, the entire chain of narrators had to be public knowledge, passed along through these wide, open networks where any other scholar could cross-check it and verify it. A private, limited chain of narrators, no matter how trustworthy you thought they were, just wasn't going to meet that standard.
So what you end up with are these two very different approaches. On one side, you've got a system that values public, widespread, and auditable chains, where every narrator is just a verifiable link. And on the other side, you have a system that values private, protected transmission from a single inherited source of authority. They're just two different answers to the exact same question. How do we guarantee that this sacred knowledge is authentic?
So does all this mean that Sunni scholars just flat out rejected the Imams or thought they were unreliable? Not even close. Let's get to the final piece of this puzzle and see what some of the biggest names in the Sunni tradition actually had to say about these very same people.
Okay, so this is a quote from Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. He's one of the absolute pillars of Sunni Hadith criticism. And his opinion on Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq is crystal clear. He doesn't just call him trustworthy, he calls him the Imam of his time and a great scholar. I mean, within this tradition, that's about the highest praise you can possibly get.
And here's another giant, the historian and scholar al-Dahabi, talking about Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. And again, the verdict is completely unambiguous, trustworthy, an authority in hadith. So he's not just seen as reliable, he's seen as a central figure, a hujjah, which means like a proof or an authority in the field.
This one might be the most surprising of all. This is from Yahya ibn Ma'in, who was a master of the science of critiquing narrators. And he gives this sweeping validation not just to the Imam himself, but to his entire school. He says everyone who narrated from al-Sadiq is trustworthy. He's basically confirming the reliability of that entire network we were just talking about.
So the conclusion here is pretty inescapable. The reason for those incredibly low numbers we saw at the very beginning, it had nothing to do with the Imam's credibility or piety. It was a technical mismatch, a methodological incompatibility. You could almost think of it like a software issue. The private, secure chains of transmission that were designed to survive political persecution simply didn't fit the criteria of a system that was built on wide, public verification.
So when you just lay it all out, side by side, the whole picture becomes so much clearer. The Sunni method was drawing from this huge pool of over 12,000 narrators in a very public system. The Shia method, which developed under constant surveillance, consolidated its knowledge through a small, highly trusted inner circle. You had two different contexts, two different scales, and so they developed two different sets of tools.
So what can look from the outside like a really deep disagreement was actually at its root a divergence of methods that was forced on them by history. This wasn't a crisis of loyalty or faith. It was an incredible example of how two communities innovated in totally different ways to protect the very same legacy. And it kind of leaves us with a bigger question, doesn't it? How often do our deepest divisions come not from what we believe, but from the different paths that history forced us all to walk?